going to talk about a very specific crisis, the bailout, and talk about how that's impacted higher education. So as someone had already mentioned, basically SUNY, or CUNY schools will start off as free. So how did it get to be that from then until now in 2010, SUNY now costs between $12,000 and $27,000 a year, depending on your room, board, tuition fees, etc. And that undergraduate students today leave with an average of over $18,000 in debt. Well, it's a long story, and it has a lot to do with organized private interest, pillaging public funds, and I don't have time to go into all the details, so for time's sake, I'm going to start with the giant bank bailout in 2008. And you may be thinking to yourself, or maybe not, because a lot of people already know the connection, but how on earth is the biggest corporate bailout in U.S. history connected to funding for public education and funding for SUNY? As you may remember, in the time leading up to the bailout, banks like AIG, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and Merrill Lynch all began reporting troubled waters ahead. The media was flooded with terms like bad assets, derivatives, risky spending. As William Grader explains, in the early autumn of 2008, mayhem swept through global financial markets. It engulfed AIG on Monday morning, September 15th. Lehman Brothers had just failed. Panicky credit markets were seizing up. AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, was hemorrhaging capital, rapidly sinking towards bankruptcy. And this crisis was due to a number of factors, including some of the ones that Fernando Leyva had laid out. Consistent deregulation of the lending market, which included limiting the oversight of government oversight of these banks, and also the limiting of risky practices. In the midst of this crisis, CEOs, corporate executives, corporate lobbyists, and even some politicians started singing a strikingly similar tune: bailout, bailout, bailout. Oh, not yet. Okay. Once this was put on the table as a possible outcome, there was overwhelming public outcry. Protests erupted in over 100 cities, followed by 251 events in more than 41 states. Massive actions were organized in major cities across the country. In a survey conducted in September 2008 by the LA Times, 55% of Americans said they opposed the bailout. The public also seemed to respond in unison, and their response was also very clear: absolutely not, no bailout. So how, in this environment of public outcry and strong opposition to the bailout, were companies like AIG and Goldman Sachs able to make out with billions of dollars of taxpayer money? Well, in part because they put exorbitant amounts of pressure on government officials, the media, the public, and all of a sudden, what seemed completely impossible became possible. Banks were awarded over $700 billion in public money, effectively stealing money that could have gone to roads, or healthcare, or education. What also became clear, and this is just an outline of the money that some of the top banks were awarded. This doesn't include all of them, this is just part. So what also became clear was that there was little to no public oversight of the money doled out. And the media became bombarded with news stories, pictures, and accounts of record-breaking corporate salaries and bonuses. And then this is also another figure, the total number of the bailout and the amount paid out in 2008, and some of the major government spending ventures in the past. So basically you can see that the bailout totaled what the U.S. spent on the Marshall Plan, the Louisiana Purchase, Moonshot, ethanol crisis, the Korean War, the New Deal, the Iraq War, Vietnam, and NASA combined, which is insane. And then, shortly afterwards, because there was no government oversight and how this was doled out, you saw record-breaking bonuses and salaries paid to corporate executives, including AIG, who got $1.6 billion of the bailout went to their corporate executives in salaries, bonuses, and benefits. So, now let's jump to 2009, where in the aftermath of this economic crisis, states across the country were reeling. In 2009, 20 million people collected unemployment, and over 5 million families lost their homes. There was a cumulative state budget shortfall of $165 billion, which is about 24% of the total bailout paid to corporations at that time. Okay, sorry, I have more to say about that. 25 states cut funds to school districts for K-12 education, preschool programs like Head Start, programs for special needs students, teacher training, math and science incentives, and adult literacy. And at least 34 states, including New York, cut funds to public education and universities, resulting in reductions in faculty and staff and increases in tuition. And then I think I have one for New York. So that's the total state aid cut in 2010, just in New York, so $1.4 billion. SUNY's budget was cut by $210 million this year, which brought the total cuts to SUNY to about 30% of its budget over the last 3 years. As you may have seen, student TAP awards were reduced by $75, and there was a 4% tuition increase for non-resident undergraduate students, and a lot of people say that this is just the beginning in terms of hikes. So New York was not unique, and we saw and felt very clearly the economic devastation through massive cuts to social services. So what does this mean here for us at SUNY Albany? First, it means that we will most likely see cuts in services, overcrowded classrooms, triple dorm rooms, which we're already seeing, a decline in full-time faculty, and hikes in tuition. And as you can see, over the past 10 years, state support has continued to decrease, and in its place, in order to make up for that, for the decline of state funds, SUNY schools have raised tuition. So you can kind of see, right there is state support and then tuition, and it wasn't until 1995 was the first time when basically tuition and fees surpassed the amount of state support that was being doled out. And also so this is tuition increases, the history of tuition increases. So what has also been very clear is that we see astronomical rises in student debt, with over 145,000 student loan accounts going into default just this year in New York alone, totaling $2 billion. And I'd also like to note that these economic impacts are not felt evenly. They hit middle-income, poor, and minority students the hardest. There continues to be significant racial disparities, with only 11 to 13% of Black and Hispanic men under 26 earning a bachelor's degree versus 30% of white men, and this goes into, by gender and race, the percentage of men and women under the age of 26 who have earned bachelor's degrees in the United States. And then this is a figure on debt. So also a larger percentage of African American undergraduates take out private loans to pay for college in comparison to whites. Between 03 and 04 and 07, 08, the percentage of African American undergrads taking out private loans quadrupled from 4 to 17%. It's also becoming more difficult for low-income and middle-income students to afford education. This table shows how college costs are becoming an increasing percentage of family income for lower and middle-class families. So in response to these devastating cuts, there's been some massive actions sparked in UC Berkeley. They saw a 30% tuition increase, drop in enrollment, massive layoffs, and so they called for March 4th of last year, 2010, a massive day of action. And there's been another call for another day of action on next Thursday, October 7th. And this was on March 4th. There was about 100 actions across the country, and this is just a map of where actions have taken place for March 4th. So what is the takeaway message from all this? It's that when states and federal governments cut education spending, it is above all a political decision, and a decision about priorities. We need to demand that New York makes education a top priority, and the whole bank bailout mess, paying out $700 billion in federal dollars, initially seemed impossible, but it happened. So we must take what now seems to us impossible and make it possible. Full state funding for SUNY, full funding for public education. Come out in solidarity on October 7th. Education is a right. Fight, fight, fight.